Morning fog drifted gently across the final mountain trails of the Andes, the same trails that had swallowed countless souls who once sought to uncover what should have remained hidden. 5 years ago, 4 hikers vanished there. No tracks, no signal, only a single soaked backpack lying beside the edge of a cliff. And then, 5 years later, one of them, Daniel Moore, suddenly reappeared. He emerged from the mist, thin and pale, whispering, "They're still there." But the story he told that day would leave everyone unsettled because no one believed it could possibly be true. At 32, Daniel had been a seasoned mountain guide, a man who knew every slope, every frozen crevice of Peru's Cordillera Blanca. He was not the reckless or dream-chasing type. Every expedition he led was carefully mapped, each step calculated through years of surviving an unforgiving terrain. But that fateful journey was different. It wasn't about tourists or guided treks. It was personal. A promise between close friends, Sarah Bennett, Lucas Hayes, and Emily Carter, to explore a part of the mountain no one had ever reached before. None of them knew that this would be the last sunrise they would ever see together on the Andes. They began their ascent in early June, when the Andes looked deceptively peaceful, peaks brushed with sunlight, rivers whispering under melting ice. Daniel had chosen this season carefully. The storms were rare, and the passes mostly clear. To the untrained eye, it was the perfect time for adventure. But those who knew the mountains understood that calm weather was only a disguise. Up here, peace never lasted long. The group gathered in the small Peruvian town of Juarez, the gateway to Cordillera Blanca. Sarah carried her camera and a worn notebook filled with sketches of mountain flora. Lucas packed his climbing gear with quiet precision, while Emily, ever the geologist, checked the layers of rock formations on her map, marking potential sites of interest. Daniel, the leader and heart of the group, inspected every rope, stove, and compass twice before they set out. It wasn't their first time together in the wild. Over the years, they had climbed canyons in Utah, crossed icy ridges in Alaska, even trekked through storms in Patagonia. But this time felt different. There was no audience, no sponsors, no one waiting at base camp to track their route. It was just the 4 of them, and a stretch of wilderness barely touched by human footprints. Locals had warned them not to go beyond the old mining road. Beyond that point, they said, the trails twisted through dense fog, and the compasses sometimes failed to point north. But Daniel only smiled and thanked them. He trusted the mountains, perhaps too much. The first few days went smoothly. They camped near a glacier-fed stream, their laughter echoing through the valley. Sarah captured sunrise after sunrise, her camera freezing moments of light as the peaks blushed gold. Lucas played soft music from a small speaker, a habit that made even the coldest nights feel warmer. Emily collected samples from boulders shaped by centuries of wind, murmuring to herself about sediment and time. Daniel kept a journal of their route, a habit he never broke. His handwriting was small, deliberate, a record of distances, temperatures, and subtle changes in the wind. In the final entries that would later be recovered, his notes turned strangely poetic. "Something about the silence feels alive. It listens when we speak. The air hums differently at dusk." On the 5th day, they reached a narrow ridge leading toward the inner range, an area rarely marked on any official map. From there, the view stretched endlessly, miles of ice fields and shadowed valleys below. They planned to descend into one of those valleys and camp near a frozen lake that, according to old records, had no name. That evening, the wind shifted. The sky dimmed with unnatural speed, as if someone had pulled a curtain over the Sunday. Emily suggested setting up camp early, but Daniel insisted they could make it down before dark. The descent was steeper than they expected. Loose stones clattered down the slope, echoing like distant footsteps. By nightfall, fog rolled in heavy, impenetrable, swallowing the beam of their flashlights. Lucas called out that he saw a faint structure ahead, something wooden, half buried in snow. They moved closer and found what looked like an old shelter, perhaps left behind by miners decades ago. Inside were rusted tools, scraps of fabric, and a pile of ashes that might once have been a fire. Someone had been there, not recently, but not too long ago either. On the far wall, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "Stay until the wind stops." Sarah laughed nervously, saying it must have been some miner's superstition. But Daniel stood still for a long moment, fingers tracing the letters as though trying to understand their meaning. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the thin walls of the shelter. Somewhere in the distance, a crack echoed sharp and sudden, like ice breaking. That night, none of them slept. When the world finally realized the 4 hikers had vanished, the storm had already erased every trace of their passage. For nearly 2 weeks, blizzards swept across the Cordillera Blanca, burying trails beneath layers of fresh snow. No one in Huaraz remembered seeing them return. Their base contact reported silence on the radio, and every message sent to their emergency beacon went unanswered. Within days, search teams formed local rescuers, mountaineers from Lima, even foreign volunteers who knew Daniel's reputation. Helicopters hovered over valleys veiled in mist, their rotors stirring up clouds of white dust. From above, the mountains looked empty, lifeless, yet something about that emptiness felt watchful. The first discovery came on the 9th day, a torn backpack half buried near a frozen ridge. Inside were a cracked lens from Sarah's camera, Emily's field notebook soaked beyond recovery, and a small metal flask engraved with Lucas's initials. There were no footprints, no equipment, no sign of a camp. It was as if the mountain had simply swallowed them whole. The rescue continued for nearly a month. Dozens of climbers combed ravines and glacier edges, their shouts echoing through canyons that gave nothing back. At night, the temperature dropped so low that tents froze from within. Some rescuers swore they heard faint voices carried by the wind. Not words, just distant tones that sounded almost human. Others dismissed it as the cry of shifting ice. Daniel's family refused to give up. His younger brother flew to Peru, begging authorities to keep searching. But each day brought the same grim result. Nothing. The only remaining theory was that the group had fallen into one of the deep crevasses hidden beneath thin layers of snow, impossible to locate without risking more lives. After 38 days, the official mission ended. Equipment was packed away, and the coordinates of their last known position were marked in red on a fading map. The case was closed quietly, recorded as another tragic accident in a place that had claimed many before them. Yet even after the authorities left, whispers lingered. Some villagers spoke of strange lights seen near the higher ridges at night, flickering like campfires, though no expedition had returned there. Others claimed to have found small pieces of fabric scattered miles apart, too clean, too new to belong to anyone else. By the time the snows melted months later, nothing remained except stories. The wind carried their names across empty valleys, but no one answered. Families built small memorials at the base of the trail, crosses made from sticks, photographs sealed in glass, while the mountain stood silent, indifferent as ever. Years passed. The world moved on. For most, the disappearance of Daniel Moore and his friends became another unsolved tragedy. Another mystery lost to the Andes. But on a quiet morning 5 years later, in a remote village far below those same peaks, a stranger stumbled out of the fog, thin, trembling, eyes wide with fear. It was Daniel. And the first thing he said was, "They're still there." When Daniel Moore was found, it was just after dawn. A farmer from a small mountain village called Yanama spotted him wandering near the riverbank, barefoot, covered in frost and dirt. The man didn't speak at first, only stared, blinking against the pale light as if it hurt his eyes. His lips were cracked, his skin ghostly, his voice little more than a whisper when he finally said his name. At first, no one believed him. Daniel Moore was a name from the past, the leader of the lost expedition, declared dead 5 years earlier. Yet the resemblance was undeniable. His fingerprints matched the records. A scar on his left wrist, identical to the one listed in the original police report, confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The man who had vanished into the Andes had somehow returned. He was taken to a local clinic where doctors noted severe dehydration, malnutrition, and a state of mental confusion. But Daniel was alert enough to speak. He kept repeating the same words. "They're still up there, but they're not the same." At first, authorities assumed trauma or delusion. Years of isolation could fracture anyone's mind. Still, they needed answers. Journalists swarmed the hospital. Reporters from Lima, even foreign networks, filled the courtyard, hoping for a statement. Daniel refused all interviews. For days, he stayed silent, sitting by the window, watching the fog roll down the mountains like slow smoke. When investigators finally arrived, they found a man both lucid and broken. His story unfolded in fragments, hesitant, filled with long pauses. But the details were too specific, too vivid to dismiss as madness. According to Daniel, the group survived the first storm by sheltering inside an old wooden hut they found halfway through the ridge. He said it wasn't on any map, hidden behind a slope where the snow rarely melted. Inside were traces of past inhabitants' tools, an old kettle, even canned food sealed decades ago. They assumed it belonged to miners or explorers. The first few nights passed quietly, then the noises began. At dusk, they would hear faint movements outside, footsteps circling the hut, too heavy to be the wind. Sarah thought it was an animal. Lucas went out once to check, but returned pale, refusing to say what he saw. After that, he stopped sleeping. Daniel's voice trembled as he recalled those nights. He said the air felt thick, as though the mountain itself was breathing. The temperature inside the hut dropped suddenly after midnight, no matter how many fires they lit. Emily, who had been the calmest of them all, started speaking in her sleep, whispering in Spanish, though she barely knew the language. On the 7th night, Sarah disappeared. Her sleeping bag was empty, her boots gone. The snow outside was untouched, no tracks leading away, no sign of a struggle. The others searched until dawn, circling the hut, calling her name until their throats bled in the cold. 2 days later, Lucas followed. One moment he was gathering firewood, the next he was gone. Only his axe was found, half buried in the snow. Daniel and Emily stayed behind, terrified to move. Then one morning, he woke to find her sitting by the doorway, staring out into the mist. When he spoke her name, she didn't turn. She just kept whispering something over and over. "We shouldn't have come here." He claimed he tried to drag her away, but the fog was too thick, the landscape unrecognizable. Eventually, he stumbled alone through miles of white silence until he collapsed near the river, the place where the farmer found him. When investigators asked for proof, Daniel insisted there was a journal in the hut, written in Old Spanish describing a guardian of the mountain who punishes those who trespass. He said the book would still be there, under a loose floorboard. A month later, a search team returned to the coordinates Daniel gave. They found nothing. No hut, no journal, no trace of life. The official report concluded that Daniel had suffered prolonged exposure, starvation, and hallucinations due to trauma. His testimony was dismissed as a tragic fantasy born of grief and isolation. But those who met him said otherwise. They remembered his eyes hollow, haunted, and certain. When a journalist asked if he still believed his friends were alive, Daniel answered softly, "Alive? No. But they're not gone either." The day Daniel was discharged from the clinic, clouds hung low over the town. He refused to stay with family, choosing instead a small cabin on the edge of Yanama, close enough to see the mountains from his window. Locals said he would stand outside for hours, staring toward the snow peaks as though waiting for something to move. Word of his survival spread fast, but curiosity soon gave way to unease. People whispered that he looked different, older than his years, his skin oddly pale, his eyes hollow, reflecting a kind of fear that didn't fade with time. When spoken to, he often paused before answering, as if checking whether someone else might respond first. Officials from Lima reopened the case after pressure from the public. They interviewed Daniel again, recording every detail. This time, his tone was steady, Deliberate, not the rambling of a broken man, but the confession of someone who had seen something beyond comprehension. He said that after Emily stopped responding, he tried to leave the hut, but the paths had changed. Landmarks he once knew, cliffs, ridges, the frozen stream were gone or rearranged, as if the mountain had shifted overnight. His compass spun uselessly. When he tried to head downhill, he always ended up circling back to the same place. For 3 days he wandered without food, convinced he was losing his mind. Then, one night, he saw a faint light flickering through the fog. He followed it, thinking it might be Sarah or Lucas. But as he approached, he saw figures standing near the hut, motionless, their outlines barely visible through the snow. At first, he thought they were his friends until he noticed the way they moved. Their heads tilted unnaturally, their arms hung limp, yet they seemed to glide instead of walk. Their faces were pale, smooth, without expression. One of them turned toward him, and in the dim glow, Daniel said he saw Emily's eyes, empty but aware. He ran. For hours, maybe days, he couldn't tell. The mountains stretched endlessly, yet he felt something following, keeping pace. Sometimes he heard voices whispering his name, sometimes footsteps that stopped when he did. And when he finally collapsed near the river, the fog broke open just long enough for him to see the valley below. "I wasn't supposed to leave," he told investigators. "They let me go because I was already broken." The officers exchanged uneasy looks, unsure whether to pity or suspect him. They pressed for more. Where was the hut? Could he guide them back? Daniel drew a rough map from memory, marking a point beyond the old mining road. It was nearly identical to the area where the first search had ended 5 years earlier. Weeks later, a new expedition was organized: soldiers, mountain guides, scientists. They followed Daniel's map precisely, but when they reached the coordinates, there was nothing. No shelter, no signs of habitation, no remnants of a fire. Even the terrain seemed inconsistent with his description. The slope he mentioned was missing. The ridge he spoke of didn't exist on any chart. Still, one of the team members, a local guide, noticed something strange. At the base of a nearby cliff, he found a wooden beam protruding from the snow, weathered and half-buried. When they dug around it, they discovered part of a wall blackened, as though burned long ago. On the wood, barely visible, were carved words: "Stay until the wind stops." The same phrase Daniel had described. The discovery caused a sensation, but officials downplayed it. The beam was taken for analysis, and the report quietly sealed. The official statement later claimed it was part of an old mining outpost destroyed by an avalanche decades earlier, but those who were there swore the timber looked too well preserved for something that old. When news reached Daniel, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he said something that unsettled everyone in the room. "If they found the wall, it means the place is awake again." A few days later, he vanished. The cabin he had rented was empty, his clothes still folded, his journal left open on the table. The last entry read, "They're calling. I hear them every night when the wind rises. I think I know what they want." After his disappearance, the region's villagers began reporting strange occurrences again. Faint lights high in the mountains, low murmurs echoing through the valleys, and on some nights, the faint shape of a fire flickering where no one should be. Authorities dismissed the sightings as hysteria fueled by rumor. The mountain, they said, was unpredictable, its landscape capable of changing with every storm. But those who live beneath its shadow still lower their voices when the wind starts to howl, because they know the story of Daniel Moore, the man who returned from the Andes, and the tale no one dared to believe. The moment Daniel's story reached the public, the world divided into two camps: those who pitied him and those who thought he was lying. The press called him the man who walked out of the mountains. But when reporters pressed him for proof, Daniel struggled. His memories were fragmented, his recollections filled with eerie details that no one could verify. He claimed he had seen lights in the fog, not like flashlights or flares, but soft, pulsing orbs that hovered above the snow. He described hearing whispers echoing between the cliffs, not from his friends, but from somewhere else. When asked how he survived 5 winters in one of the most merciless mountain ranges on Earth, Daniel had no clear answer. He remembered sheltering in a cave, eating roots and melted snow, and then blank spaces, stretches of time erased from his mind. Investigators retraced the path of the group using Daniel's new testimony. They returned to the Andes, guided by local climbers and rescue dogs. What they found was stranger than anyone expected. About a mile from where the group's last campsite was recorded, they discovered a small clearing surrounded by twisted trees that shouldn't have grown at that altitude. Beneath the frost, faint footprints were visible, circling the area. The tracks didn't belong to Daniel, nor to any of the other missing hikers. Some appeared barefoot. Nearby, they unearthed a rusted metal canteen engraved with initials that didn't match any known hiker from the expedition. It was old, perhaps decades, maybe more. Forensic experts dated it to the 1,970 seconds, long before Daniel's group vanished. That single discovery fueled countless speculations. Some locals began whispering about an old legend, El Valle del Silencio, the Valley of Silence. It was said to be cursed, a place where lost souls wander, and where time bends in strange ways. Shepherds claimed to hear voices when passing through, even on clear days. Others believed Daniel had stumbled upon an isolated survivalist group living deep in the mountains, hiding from the modern world. But if that were true, why didn't he remember their faces? Why couldn't he recall how he escaped? When a journalist from Santiago interviewed Daniel months later, he seemed older, much older than his age suggested. His beard had grayed, his hands trembled slightly, and his eyes often drifted toward the window as if still seeing the snow. During the conversation, he mentioned a sound that haunted him, a low hum, like the earth itself breathing beneath the ice. It followed us, he said quietly. And when the others stopped responding, I knew something had changed. Psychologists proposed that Daniel's story was a blend of trauma and delusion, that his mind created hallucinations to fill the unbearable gaps of solitude. Yet, there were still questions science couldn't answer. In one of his early medical examinations, Daniel's blood tests revealed abnormal markers, slight radiation exposure, inconsistent with his known environment. No one could explain it. Years passed, and still no trace of the other hikers was ever found. Their families held vigils each winter, lighting candles at the trailhead, waiting for answers that never came. Meanwhile, Daniel withdrew from the public eye, settling in a small coastal town. But even there, locals reported strange occurrences. Visitors claimed that on quiet nights, he would walk to the shoreline and stare at the dark horizon for hours, murmuring softly in Spanish, repeating the same phrase over and over. They're still up there, waiting. And whether those words were a confession, a warning, or a memory too painful to erase, no one could ever truly know. Years slipped quietly by, yet Daniel's story refused to fade. It became part of mountain folklore, half tragedy, half mystery. The Andes, once a place of breathtaking beauty, now carried a ghostly reputation. Hikers who passed through the same region spoke of strange sensations, the feeling of being watched, the echo of footsteps behind them, and flickers of light drifting across the ridges when the wind fell silent. Daniel himself grew frail. He seldom spoke about those 5 lost years anymore, but his eyes betrayed a lingering terror, as if part of him had never truly come down from the mountains. On a cold winter morning, 5 years after his return, a neighbor found him sitting on his porch overlooking the sea. His body was still, his gaze fixed toward the horizon. In his lap lay an old leather notebook, its final page torn halfway through by trembling hands. The last words, written in uneven ink, read, "If you ever hear the wind calling your name, don't answer." That single line reignited the fascination surrounding his case. Journalists revisited the story, researchers tried once more to decode his accounts, and online forums buzzed with theories. Some believed Daniel had been marked by whatever lived in those peaks, that he carried something back with him. Others thought the notebook was a poetic farewell, the final whisper of a man who never escaped his memories. But to those who'd lost loved ones in the mountains, Daniel's warning felt deeply personal. It wasn't superstition, it was grief, wrapped in mystery. Perhaps he wanted others to understand that some places are not meant to be conquered, that nature holds corners where time itself forgets to move. And so, the legend of the lost hikers endures a chilling reminder that even in the age of satellites and maps, there are still places on Earth that remain untouched, unexplained, and unkind to the human heart. If Daniel's story teaches anything, it's this: silence can speak louder than screams, and sometimes the mountains remember what people try to forget. If stories like this haunt your thoughts and stir your curiosity, subscribe to Last Scene, where every mystery has a heartbeat and every silence hides a truth waiting to be uncovered.